Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Distant Relatives. I am your host, Jamal, and today I am very excited to welcome into the studio a longtime mentor, friend, professor, so many different ways that we are connected and related to one another at this point. But Dr. Kenja McCray, thank you for joining us.
Hey, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah, so for those of you who this may be your first time tuning into Distant Relatives, this is a show dedicated to talking to people around the African diaspora, talking about our varied experiences and ways that we can better connect to one another. It is aptly called Distant Relatives exactly for that reason, because I believe that we of people of African descent are all related to one another. We have more similarities than differences, and sometimes we allow other people to, tell us or curate our narrative for us. And this is us, chipping away at that and taking a bit of our, control back into how we define ourselves and how we see one another as Black peoples around the world. So I want to jump right in to the first question. So first of all, Dr. McCray, tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you are doing, and just how you came to be where you are.
Okay. I am originally from Birmingham, Alabama. I came here to Atlanta, Georgia to get a bachelor's degree from Spelman College. I got that degree in history. Went on to Clark Atlanta University, got a master's degree, and eventually got a Ph.D. from Georgia State University in history as well. I teach at Atlanta Metropolitan State College. Mostly, I teach United States surveys, United States history surveys, pre and post Civil War. I also teach African American culture, and I love it. Yep, that's what I do. My research interests range from United States history in the 20th century to African diaspora history, African Americans, Pan-Africanism, transnationalism, all with a focus on women's history and leadership.
Okay, great. And I have your website and your Twitter handle up here just for, the sake of anyone who is interested in any of those things and want to reach out to you to get any type of information, or, maybe we can get some gigs out of this. You know how to reach her. And so on that, I'm going to be honest. I've known you for a while. I think 2008 is when I met you, which seems like 1,000 years ago. But
especially in COVID years, right?
Right. And I don't know how that never came up in our talking. Like, I never knew that you were from Alabama. I don't know why it never came up. So coming from Alabama, right? What was it like growing up there, and what was your primary school education like? Did you learn, what was your Black history context? Because you got a bachelor's in history and you have a PhD in history. So something sparked your interest in history. And as a Black person from the South myself, it's just interesting because I know I didn't get much from history in my education. So from your formal education, K through 12, what sparked your interest in history, and was there any type of elements of Black relevant history, not just, February things, but any relevant history to you as you learned?
So growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, there is a great sense of history in the city
Mm-hmm.
itself. So, it's the home of 16th Street Baptist Church. We eventually got a civil rights institute that reflected that rich and storied history of Birmingham, Alabama, and the people who make it, right, make the city. In terms of my education, I initially, when I grew up, I lived in the same home as my mom grew up in. So in elementary school, let's say, I attended the same school she attended when she was in elementary school. And even though this was the 1970s, post Brown versus the Board of Education, by 20 years, the school was still de facto, right, segregated.
Right.
So in that environment, I always got a dose of Black culture and history. I remember the books that were read to us, Ezra Jack Keats, and the programs that we put on. There is a man that's still alive, who is still alive and around Atlanta today, Baba Atu, who came to Birmingham and taught us funga, the very basic first African dance a lot of us all learned in that school. So that was my early exposure to Black history and culture. But what's the issue with segregated schools? It's not being around African Americans. The segregated schools were an opportunity to center ourselves in our curriculum in a lot of ways. But it's the lack of resources. I just remember the principal, we were all sitting in the hall. I think he brought us out into the hallway and sat us kindergartners and first graders along the hallway and talked to us about how, to that day, the Board of Education was not funding us in the same way as the majority white schools. And he gave an example of how he found out that even the majority white schools at the time received different toilet paper. We received a rougher kind of toilet paper in the schools. So that was the challenge of segregated schools. And my mother knew that very well. So once she was finishing her bachelor's degree during these years in education, early childhood education. So once she began to get positions in the Birmingham city schools, she found out that there was a way that she could transfer me to a different school. And she found a loophole. I was able to travel there with my aunt, who was also an early childhood teacher. She said she filled out some paperwork and explained to me it would be more convenient for her to put me in my aunt's car rather than to try and figure out a way for me to get to the neighborhood school. So I began right into a much more integrated, racially integrated school with more resources by late elementary, early middle school. And in that school, I don't recall that there was a lot of emphasis placed on Black history and culture. It was a very multicultural experience, though. It was in that school that I, learned about all different kinds of cultures. It was in a part of Birmingham where a lot of Lebanese Americans had settled. And so that's where I learned about Lebanese culture and foods. And we would trade lunches. I remember that. And I would bring something my grandmother had prepared, some good old soul food, leftovers in my lunch, and would often trade them for some of these other types of foods that the kids were bringing, like baklava and meat pies and things. So it was very, very multicultural. And I think, our critique of multiculturalism is it's a good thing, but it also can decenter African American and African perspectives in ways that are not necessarily productive for us in certain manners. So it's not as if anti-blackness didn't rear its head in this space. It did, right?
Right.
It's not as if white supremacy didn't also exist there.
Right.
It did. Yeah, if there's no concerted effort to be anti-racist, to not be anti-black, then it still exists in multicultural spaces. So those were the types of things that I had to navigate there and in my high school. So, and I hated history in high school. I hated it. May my high school history teacher rest in peace. It was like you mentioned in a previous conversation of ours, just numbers, memorizing dates and people, great men, right? I didn't like that approach to history.
Right.
My love of history was really sparked in undergraduate studies at Spelman College.
And so you came in as an undecided major, and
I did.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was like, where did this love of history come from Alabama's education? I just,
You're right about that. Yeah. I mean, the love of history came from the way history was delivered, the way history was taught at Spelman College. It was definitely, even before they had classes and a department that focused on the African diaspora and its relationship to the world, they really took a diasporic approach to history, even in the basic U.S. history survey, and a real critical thinking approach rather than a rote memorization approach. And that's what really made me fall in love with history. Yep. And I think we've lost Jamal. Oh no. So I don't know if I should just continue on telling my story. But yeah, that's where I really fell in love with history. The open-ended questions that we got at Spelman College that really prompted you to think. I struggled with it at first. I had really good patient professors who would get into those papers and really challenge us to think more deeply, to think more broadly, and then return papers and have us rewrite them often so that our thinking was deepened, our ideas were sharpened. And I really, really appreciated that and benefited from that, and obviously fell in love with history in a way that, I have committed to it for life. And I think Jamal wanted me to talk about when I got to Atlanta Metropolitan State College, how I got the idea to infuse African and African diasporic perspectives into the U.S. History Survey. He said before we got on, like, I took United States history from you. I never took African American studies from you. I never took African American culture from you. But I never thought twice about that. That was an approach to teaching the United States History Survey that I developed from, one, being on the ground at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and looking at my classroom demographics, which were 95, I would say, plus percent African descended people. So I decided to take that approach to center the people in my classrooms in United States history. So I think we lost you. Yeah, so I finished my story about go ahead.
Yeah, I was listening. So no, I appreciate you keeping that going. My internet, I think sometimes especially when I'm having this show, we go a little deep, especially that we were tackling education. Somebody is like trying to shut me up. But we will not be stopped.
No, we won't. We will forge ahead.
No, I appreciate everything you were saying. I wanted to go back to a point about your elementary school, though, the first one you were at. So you're telling me that your principal sat down with the kindergartners and first graders and told you guys about the disparities in the school board funding the schools.
Yes, I
And
remember
this
that
was
very well.
like during the, and this wasn't like a parent teacher conference. This was just the principal talking to the classes of
Yes,
kindergartners and first graders. And this is
yes,
a Black principal, correct?
right.
And so I wanted to hone in on that because that stuck out to me, because I believe that sometimes we underestimate what our children can actually comprehend. And I'm sure that this that experience stuck with you until today. That's something that you remember. And I know a lot of people who can't remember things, prior to the age of 10, because whatever it is that they did or nothing significant really, you remember those things that kind of stick out because days start to blend together as you live longer. But that part, and I wanted to let you continue, which is why I didn't stop you, because I wanted to keep your flow going. But that right there is something in itself that is very important, especially when we're talking about education, and especially when we're talking about dealing with Black youth. It's not like, he set you guys down and like talk to you with puppets or, try to bring it so low to a childish level. He brought it and, used the example of toilet paper, which is something that everyone uses at that age, that you could understand the differences in, right? In the quality of that. And something as simple as that showed you and the rest of your classmates and peers of, what he's talking about at that level so that you could understand it. But being able to communicate that where you understood that is very impressive. So I just want to, shout out to that principle, because I have very strong beliefs in not doing the goo goo gaga with babies and speaking to them like people, like speaking to them the way that you want them to speak back to you, because all they're doing at this young age is just soaking up information. And you'll be surprised with how much they're soaking up and retaining without you knowing. Because there's so many things just in my life that I remember knowing and I don't ever remember learning, which means somewhere around me, I soaked that up from just being around things. So that's a credit to my grandparents and my parents and, people that were around me, just probably just having conversations. Right. And so I had to give a spotlight and a highlight to just that element. And you ended up leaving that school, which, it was under resourced. But I think that a part of what you were just talking about with that culturally relevant education, that is the epitome of culturally relevant, right? It doesn't have to be, this is what the Black person did at this point. It just has to reflect who you're talking to, your audience, and you guys as Black children in that city, your principal, like the leader of the entire school, having that wherewithal to say, I'm going to let them know what we're dealing with as children. And, a lot of the times in the Black community, we go down this path of stay out of, grown folks' business, or this is grown folks' conversation. And then when you become grown folks, you realize that nothing about grown folks' business was ever fun. I wish they would have let us in so we wouldn't have been so ready and in a rush to go be a part of those conversations. But I just really respected that element of your story. And that was amazing, honestly. The second thing to note is you talked about white supremacy in the midst of multiculturalism, and the fact that white supremacy doesn't always have to come from white people. Everyone buys into white supremacy. And so, we as Black people buy into it from the fact of us seeing ourselves as inferior in some of the things that we don't go after, or some of the ways that we limit ourselves and we limit our family members. Like as parents, you may limit your children from aspiring to do a certain thing because of your relationship with the real world. and you don't want them to be heard, or you don't want them to bring too much attention to themselves. And so we will, create this barrier around our own expectations based around where we exist. And so I wanted to hone in back on that multicultural part of white supremacy, because I've seen it in my travels. I've been to Asia, I've been to Hong Kong, I've been to the Philippines, I've been to Peru. And so even though these aren't white people, their relationship to Black people is very much filtered by the media and how white supremacy presents us to the world. Talk to me a little more about that point from your educational experience. Was it something like that with, your peers and classmates? And just give us a little bit more, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So I'll give you an example. Many cultures existed in these spaces. But what I mean by multicultural spaces that may still be in service of white supremacy is this. Looking at the data, most of the African descended people were in the lower ranked courses, lower level courses. There were gifted courses in terms of high school. There were AP courses, but what did the data say about where the African descended people were? Were as many or proportionate to their numbers? Were they in AP courses? Were they in advanced courses? Did they take leadership positions? Or did most of the leadership look like people who were other, non-African descended, non-African and African descended? I, in high school, went to a school of performing arts, and my focus was dance. I was a dance major. So white supremacy in multicultural settings looks like white normalcy. So when when the normal thing that we all do, we're all participating. Asian Americans, Latinx, people from Latinx communities, African and African descended peoples, European and European descended peoples. We're all there in the space. But when we say dance, when people say dance, what do they mean? Absolutely. Why would you question that? They mean classical ballet. That was the offering. At a public school in a majority African American city that was a part of that city's school system, your only offering was classical ballet. And everything that came along with grooming students to get an excellent training in classical ballet and positioning them to move on to professional positions in the world of dance. So a bun, I was told to get a real bun, which meant straight. In fact, in recent, not so distant history, some of us graduates had to rally to stop that same dance department from making rules, developing regulations that said, reiterated, no locks, no buns made out of locks, no men with long hair, no males with long hair. Women have to have long hair. No buns from locks, no cornrows, no braids of any type, no colors in your hair, right? But most of the rules and regulations were at this school where African Americans and African descended people made up a minority of the classical dance students. Most of the rules were directed at Black hairstyles. Right. So, but this is a multicultural setting. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. If that illustrates.
Right. No, definitely. And and I wanted to. So you're talking about your high school, right? And I want to jump on to an HBCU. And this isn't me, downing this HBCU, but Hampton University, I remember because I went to Howard, and I remember people at Howard who were in Howard's business school talking about, yeah, Hampton doesn't allow you to be in their business school if you have locks or if you have certain styles of hair. And I was like, at a black school? So that's, our historically black institution, but it is still framed within white supremacy and creating limitations on the surface level. It just seems like on our aesthetic, right? But that's if you're only looking at it from the surface. But if you are looking to it the way we look at things on a deeper level, it is really making you question and challenge the acceptability of who you are and just how you were made. Like, our hair isn't straight, and our hair locks naturally if you don't do anything to it. Like, my grandmother had a single lock because she just wore her hair in a scarf for like 20 years and didn't comb it. And so she had a lock she had a de facto lock. And it was and it was just very surprising to me that this is the 21st century when I went to college. This is 2006, and we still had limited rules on how we could look at our institution, and we no longer had the excuse that the institution was, started by, white people, or, it was a long time before we got a black president at some of our HBCUs. No. At this point, most of our institutions were run and operated by us, but we were still reinforcing the ideals of the greater society. And we're talking about business school, and I just want to hone in on this element. Most people who go to business school, I would believe, want to go into business for themselves. Entrepreneurs, or maybe you want to rise up the ranks of some corporate company, maybe. But if you're in business on your own, why are you limiting how you look or limiting the expression of you as a person? Like, you work for you. You can create your own standards at your business. So creating those limitations are, even bringing that into our black workplaces when we actually, I want to work for a black owned business, but that black owned business has conservative white supremacy standards. What's the difference? And that's kind of like what we're building. So we have to be very conscious of that. So yeah, I'm glad you went into that multicultural piece, because sometimes people, how we get tricked into, now it's not, what are we doing for black people? What are we doing for people of color? And that's the new trick they're putting on us. The formal trick that happened in my lifetime was, making us accept the term minority. And how many people does that include? And now we are on this POC kick, and everybody's just happy to be a POC. But all POCs aren't for us. It's some anti-black POCs. And some of them are intentional, and some of them are just by default of what they have been taught. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about what you were saying. I think I just wanted to be clear. What I'm not saying is that there should not be any multiculturalism, or that there's
Right.
no. I recognize the strength and the necessity in identifying non-white people as people of color, and expressing that non-white people have common experiences with racism, with classism, and that is a useful categorization sometimes. But I think what we're trying to do is raise awareness and challenge people and say, you just can't leave it at that. Oh yeah, it's a multicultural
Right.
space. We let you in. I had this conversation with a political scientist, and generally these conversations arose with people from a generation ahead who were like, they work mightily. We appreciate that, to pry open the doors.
Mm-hmm.
And once the doors were open and people in my generation, Generation X, were able to go in, not only did they work mightily to pry open the doors, but they made a lot of strides to make it so that class-wise, there would be no question that I could be in this space where classical ballet was the type of dance offered, because they worked hard to afford me, the access to ballet classes to be able to audition to get into the school. And I appreciate that. But I think there was a lack of understanding that also pushed me toward humanities, social sciences, Black history, Black African American studies, because I kept trying to explain. Of course, in high school, I didn't have the words for it, what was going on in those classrooms. And my mom would say, well, you should just be happy to be there. We worked mightily to just get you there. Just behave. That is a bun. That is the bun. Hair is supposed to be straight. Put your hair in a bun, like just do it and stop complaining. And I didn't get the words until I was a graduate student, I think, about what was going on. It's not enough to just accept us into the spaces physically, but then still center, like you're saying, Eurocentric values and views. You got to let go of some of that power and decenter yourself. And I know that's not easy. Right. And power is not going to concede anything without demand sometimes. Right. But
exactly.
Right. But that was the next step, and there were gradations there too, because I was told, this girl whose parents are, from the continent also now wants to be, centered in this dance program, and she's nothing like you. Your ankles are so much more delicate, and your, stereotypes, right? And there was I don't think it ever crossed their mind to broaden the types of dance that they offered and to include all kinds, including African forms, so that then the African aesthetic is centered, like to decenter European art, aesthetics and art forms. Who does that? They're normal, right? That's what I mean by white normalcy. But we're not knocking multiculturalism, or but we're saying it's not perfect by far. Yeah.
I believe that the best way I can sum it up for myself is that it really isn't multiculturalism until it is not ethnically centered on any one thing, on any one geographic location, on any one ethnicity. It can be a lot of people in a space, but if you're telling them that they have to assimilate to fit in and just be happy to be here, then it is not multiculturalism in reality. It is just it's an aesthetic of it. It's it on the surface of just people being in a place, right? But there is no real attempt at actually learning from other people. Dr. Asa Hilliard talked about a type 1 question and a type 2 question. Type 1 question is, I base your intelligence on the fact of, do you know what I know? And that is how I ascertain your level of intelligence. The type 2 question is, what do you know? So it's already giving value to whatever it is that your knowledge base or your experiences are. If you go to Ghana in 1480 and you ask them about the history of medieval Europe and they don't know, and you tell them that they're uneducated, that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. Why would they know? Why is it important? Why would that be relevant to them? But when you go there and ask them what they know and what their skills are, you'll be surprised at what you can learn and what you can take back and in exchange reciprocity. That's multiculturalism. That's the benefit of it. But if it's just people from different places all fitting into one box of expectations, then to me, that is not a real view of multiculturalism. It's just talking points and probably, quotas that need to be met. So that's what I'm challenging. So, just to back up your point, I'm not challenging multiculturalism. I just want to make sure that when we are given these talking points by the media, whoever feeds the media their information, when we receive words like minority, when we just loosely accept words like POC, and especially in the political realm, when we are saying we demand this for the Black community, and they're like, okay, we'll do this for POCs. They've just changed the entire conversation. And the same thing happened during integration. We are doing segregation. We said we want desegregation. They said integration. And I've spoken to a lot of people who were alive during that time. I was on a bus with Dr. C.T. Vivian going to reenact the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I was on a bus with Dr. C.T. Vivian and some other people, and we were on a bus from Atlanta to Selma, and he was talking. He was confirming things that I had read, that they never ever had integration in their rhetoric. At any point were they asking for integration. They wanted desegregation. They just wanted it to not be illegal for me as a Black person to walk on a sidewalk or to access public things that my tax dollars paid for. We were never asking to be thrust upon and into white institutions with no thought, right? And so I want to make sure that when we are having these talking points, because I know a lot of people have these types of conversations and they are very, a lot of people get emotional and they get very radical in their speech, but they're not very clear. And what that does is it opens up people to have a valid counter argument when we are, basing our experiences not only based off anecdotal experiences, but also data and what we are still facing elements of what our ancestors faced, which we should be, beyond. But sometimes we allow ourselves to be duped. And here's the thing that you taught me. And I think it happened the first day I walked into your classroom. You wrote discourse on the board. And it became one of my favorite words because it's a word that allows you to understand words and understand what you're saying and making sure that what you're saying is accurate, even if it takes longer to say it. It's more to say enslavement than slavery. It takes longer to say enslaved African than slave. Right? And so being able to distinguish those things and understanding that just by saying slave and saying that your ancestors were slaves does something to you internally where and it's very easy to begin history at enslavement in that era if you just say slave. If you say enslaved African, the word enslaved itself already means an action. It's a verb. You have to enslave someone. That means something has been done to somebody. They weren't just born in that state. And then when you put the African part on it, then you root that person from their origin. So now okay, so by default, I couldn't possibly start this person's history right here in that state because they were taken from somewhere and they've been put into this state. So something had to precede that. So it's a built-in, prequel. But yeah, that was what I learned from you. And I said, that was the first thing you ever said to us as a class. And what got you to that point where, so again, that reminds me of your principal, your elementary school principal. That is cultural relevance. And it's not even, when you talk about discourse, it's not even any one particular ethnicity of cultural relevance. It's cultural relevance you know, regardless of who your audience is. Because once you drive home that, you know, you are being very careful and articulate and intentional about the words that you use, that can reflect on anyone in the audience. Everyone in there has to understand what they're talking about, what it is that they're saying, with intention of, this is the point. I'm using these words for a reason. What got you to that point? How did you get there as a professor?
So, can I answer that after I comment on your comments about integration and segregation?
Sure.
And desegregation. I'm glad you brought that up. I am writing a book chapter on an activist named Connie Tucker. It is for a book called Black Power in Florida. So it's looking at her activism in Florida. Eventually, she becomes a central figure in the Southern environmental justice movement. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, she was in Florida, in Tampa. So that is one of the things that she and other members of the Black student movement in Florida focused on, this integration versus desegregation issue. And she and her compatriots really articulated this idea that the way integration was done really put a burden on African American students and parents. Not only she was quoted in a newspaper article, not only she was desegregated. She went to a set of schools called the Booker schools, and she was integrated and was sent to a majority white school. And she said, you know, constantly on top of being worried about getting the work, you know, done, understanding the academic lessons that were being imparted, she had to deal with students, like you're saying, who felt she was thrust into their happily white environment. So their hostility, and also think about whether she was properly assimilating. So whether she was saying things correctly. In the late 60s, people were starting to wear their hair not pressed, natural. And she said she got a lot of ribbing about that. So on top of getting her academics in order, she has to deal with all these social issues. And they were being bussed. And where the Booker schools have been under-resourced, in the area of, at this time it was Sarasota, Florida, that she was living in, Newtown, was under-resourced. They, as I said, got a culturally relevant education that centered their lives, their ideas, their struggles. So to go and be thrust into an environment where your struggles are not the norm, your points of view are not the norm, and people like you are considered socially, economically, politically lower on the social totem pole, it was difficult. But to add insult to injury, the Black schools, like the Booker schools, were being destroyed. So once the plan was to, once we get all these Black students scattered into the majority white schools, we're going to come in. I interviewed a man who was Connie Tucker's compatriot, Imam Akil, and he, Askia Muhammad Akil is his full name. He said that they were going to go in and do things like tear down the schools and not even, like take out the trophy cases and throw their trophies in the garbage and things like that. Like no regard for these Black institutions, these majority Black institutions, and the lives that they reflected. So I totally understand what you're saying in terms of making the fine distinction between desegregation and integration.
Let me ask you a question.
Mhm.
Is there any research on what happened to the employment rate of the teachers and principals and administrators from that period, like when they started to actually integrate schools, and how that impacted the community of, like, as an educator, it's a stable job. That's a stable career. But if you are an administrator at one of these Black schools where your student body is being taken from you, or you were a teacher, like what happened to these people? Is there research on that?
Yeah, and I wanted to actually direct you to a person who's doing research on that field. I know her as Fumilayo. And I'll get you the information, her information, but that is what her area of research is on. But and she could tell you offhand what the sources are in terms of what happens to the employment prospects of African American teachers and school administrators in the aftermath of these integration efforts. And believe me, the African American teachers were losing their jobs. African American principals were facing the prospect of losing their jobs. Yes. So I'll give you her information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring that up because I think that's an element that we kind of gloss over a lot. I don't really hear a lot of people mentioning that or even considering that, especially, the teachers. I believe that even if it's more of a challenge, I think as a teacher, you could probably get a job somewhere. But as an administrator, who's going to hire Black administrators at a white school when they don't even want the Black students there? Right. So that right there, my attention has been drawn to that a lot lately, probably like within the past decade, of like really just assessing that whole thing. But you were making a point. I just wanted to chime in on that.
No. I was going to answer your second question about how I got to the point of. I do believe you're asking me how I got to the point of starting the U.S. History Survey, U.S. History 1 survey with Africa. Right?
So
is that your question?
Let me pause you for a moment and just give some context. So, as I stated, so just some history about me. I know Dr. McCray because she was my professor at Atlanta Metropolitan College, now Atlanta Metropolitan State College. So I was there because I was at Howard, where I started my college career, and I ran out of funds. My Pell Grant disappeared, whatever. And I came back to Atlanta, my hometown, and my brother was like, just go to Atlanta Metro and, do some classes until you get the money to get back to Howard. And I was like, okay. And that was my whole mindset. I was only there to take courses that I hadn't taken at Howard to go back. And I ended up in Dr. McCray's class. And first of all, the first thing was her class at Atlanta Metro, because I had this idea about junior college. And when I stepped in her class, I was like, oh, this isn't a lower quality of education than I was receiving at Howard. This lady knows what she's talking about, and I can really fit in here, and I can excel here and still be what I need to be. And then on top of that, I took US history from her, and she intertwined elements. I felt like I was taking African American studies, and I knew she taught that, but I never took that class from her. I took US history too. And there were elements, it was always relevant to us, to the student body. And then again, on that point of discourse, she made sure that she challenged us to be intentional with our words and our speech, and to make sure that we weren't just loosely saying things, because the media and a lot of even educated people use things out of context. They use racism when they mean bigotry. They say they use systematic things when they mean a interpersonal exchange. And so understanding the differences in those qualities and the qualifications of the words and what they actually mean and how they make impact, drives a long way into just reforming the way that you think and really going on that part. So I wanted to give you that credit, and also, give Atlanta Metro the credit that they deserve. And then you convincing me to not just look at it as a speed bump, right? But as an actual institution to be respected and regarded. And you convinced me to graduate, which I did, which is probably one of the best decisions that I made. So I appreciate you, but I want to give you the spotlight of, letting the people know how you got to that point of intertwining cultural relevance into your courses like that. And then just, making that impact, because that discourse point sticks with me to this day.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'm so, glad and appreciative of you for telling me that I made an impact. I was in it. I am in it for the love of it and for these types of outcomes. So in terms of focusing on the words, right? The vocabulary, I actually came to that point by teaching in the classroom, and I realized the gap in the teaching and the learning process. A part of it was coming from the vocabulary, the end of things, and students, because their vocabulary could use shoring up, they weren't understanding and comprehending some of the concepts that they were expected to comprehend in the U.S. History Survey. Right. So I, over time, developed this focus on vocabulary. So I began introducing the importance of vocabulary in those first courses because of that. So that's where that came from. And you're exactly on the right track. Coming from Birmingham, Alabama, and having the gaps in my own education, I realized, if I ever teach history, if I ever teach anything like culture, humanities, I'm not going to, if I'm supposed to be teaching about United States history, start with slavery. You pick that up perfectly. And I don't know what day it popped into my head, like, why does this feel so uncomfortable? I just remember sitting in class and saying, why does this feel so uncomfortable? And I said, I know, because we started the Europeans' history in the United States in Europe, European Americans in Europe. And we talked about the background of the Native American Indians. It was the 80s, 80s, maybe early 90s. And so the educational system had come far enough, the curriculum had come far enough to say, well, we need to talk more about Native American Indians, right? And where, what they were doing before Europeans got here. But at that time, the book I had still, I always tell my students, I don't know if I told you all, says A New World is Discovered, that first chapter. Whereas the book that you all used says something like Three Worlds Collide, right? As a name for the first chapter. That first chapter in the book that I have, and I still have it on my shelf, said A New World is Discovered. it still said that, but it also said more about Native American Indians' history prior to Europeans coming. But Africans, no, it started with slavery. And I said, one thing I'll do is, I promise you, I will start with West Africa, pre Henry the
Pre-colonial.
Navigator, Africa, even before colonial, right? Pre-age of exploration Africa. So so that's what I did, and I'm glad that you benefited from it. I've had to argue with textbook companies who want to sell me a book that doesn't go in depth into African culture and history in the U.S. History Survey books, U.S. History 1 survey. And I was told one time by a textbook company, well, yes, that's why we give you professors, the flexibility to add your own material. And I said, so basically I'm going to have to do double the work? No. You know what? A good treatment of Africa needs to be in this textbook before I think about adopting it. It's a struggle. It's a real struggle. And so that's why my class, U.S. history class, looks like that. That's one of the reasons why my U.S. history class looks like that, with the demographics of Atlanta Metropolitan State College. Do we skip European history? No. Do we short Native American Indians and their historical, background? No. We make sure that we focus, on all three, but I do treat certain issues, as paramount given the demographics of the classroom. If they change, I will adjust. So it's not saying that this is not to say that everybody isn't welcome. Everybody is welcome there, but again, if you're used to centering European stories, that's not what's going to happen here.
Right. So, and I wanted to piggyback off of your point. It's like that meme that I see sometimes on social media, and it says like pro-black doesn't mean anti-white.
Right.
So just because we are elevating, the black significance in history to the same level of the other people's significance doesn't mean that we have to belittle their aspect of it. So like you say, it's not elevating the African aspect to skip over the European part, or to do less of a dive into the indigenous, American peoples, right? And you can do all of them. What a thought. Like all of it, there's time. As much time as we spend, doing 3, chapters of world history on Greece, you can take some of that out. Like you can cover that in 1.5 chapters, and then go and add other people's stories. Like, and I always talk about my world history class in high school, where we had one chapter in there, and it went from ancient Kemet to Martin Luther King. One chapter. And we skipped it.
I don't doubt that. I don't doubt it at all.
2 chapters. We had 2 chapters in there about Rome. And Rome is a city, for those of you guys who, struggle with geography. We had 3 chapters about Greece. Greece is a small little island, it still has some historical significance, but I'm talking about the size. So Rome is a city. There's 2 full chapters on like pre-Caesar and post-Caesar, whatever. And then there are eras that they go into in Greek history. And then they have 1 chapter in Africa that starts, it has like a little paragraph about ancient Egypt. It goes into a little bit about West Africa. And then it goes into like modern day Black experiences. And that's our wrap up in world history. And this is why we don't have any like context of timelines. I make this joke all the time because I think it's true. There are people who believe that Martin Luther King knew Frederick Douglass, because when we learn Black history, we don't learn time. We don't learn how long things, have been. We just learn a list of names, like you said before, referenced, dates, memorization, and regurgitation. And history at a certain point, even if it says 1860 and 1960, as a child growing up, you just say old, right? At a certain point, you just say that happened a long time ago. So all of it probably happened around the same time. So you don't even know who were peers, who were these people's influences. Like the fact that Benjamin Banneker was a great influence on a Dr. King. You just say old people history all
You're
together,
exactly
especially when it comes to Black history. It's just Black History Month, the way it was done when I was in school. It was just like, these are the inventors of things, and be happy about that. These are the people who were the first to do, things that Europeans held only for themselves, be happy about that. These are the people who were, activists. No context, relatability of how these things all fit together, the strategy behind some of their actions. None of that is there. So it's just important, like, and I say all that to again commend what you did, because honestly, I was there for a hot second and with the intention to leave. And based on what I had experienced at Howard, and the reason that I wanted to go to Howard is because there were protests, student protests at Howard, to demand for them to change their curriculum and for it to be more culturally relevant. And I remember seeing a documentary. I had to be in like 10th grade about that. And I was like, oh, that's the school I'm going to. Because they made sure that they reflect. And again, cultural relevance isn't about painting it just overly about, this is a Black person who did math and this is a Black person who did science. It's not that simple. It's integrated into it seamlessly. Just it normalizes it, like you were talking about. White supremacy is more of like white normalcy and having everything else be other. What culturally relevance does is it normalizes everyone's experience. And so it integrates it into there naturally. So when I studied psychology at Howard, we talked about Franz Fanon and Du Bois. We talked about Jung and Freud, but we talked about Du Bois and Fanon at the same level of impact. And the same thing was relevant in, chemistry courses and whatever it is that you took. You understood your place in that field and how it related to you and your people. And so that's what I got when I got to Atlanta Metro, when I entered your class. And then there were other people, Professor Belazaire, who did similar things. And it was just very important it was serendipitous for me, because had it not been that, coming from my mindset at the time, I would have been like, all right, let me get through this. And that's what I walked into your classroom with, that mindset. And then you broke it right away.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad I was able to make a positive impact with, from my experiences, right? Based on my experiences. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to say that I said my own experiences shaped my approach to teaching. The people who are in front of me in the classroom shaped my approach to teaching, but also my peers and my mentors shaped my approach to teaching. And one particular person I want to give a shout out to is Professor Masiki Scales. And most people who encounter him around Atlanta know him as the musician, the band leader. But I met him when he was a student, a master's student at Clark Atlanta University, and I was an undergraduate student at Spelman, and he was a teaching assistant for a class I was taking, cross-registered for at Clark. And he's been a great colleague and friend ever since. And when I said, I finally got a gig, Professor Scales, but it's U.S. history. And I wonder, how do I approach U.S. history? And he said, I shouldn't be saying this in public, right? Especially in this climate, because Trump is after us for teaching U.S. history like this, right?
My internet might go out again, but
I know,
say
right?
it anyway.
I said, I can't believe Trump didn't call me out by name with this initiative. But Professor Scales said, well, I just teach my U.S. history survey like I would teach African American history. And I was like, whoa, okay. So that was my approach. How do I teach the U.S. history survey more like African American history? And I didn't get assigned an African American history class at Atlanta Metropolitan State until later. And I thought, wow, how do I go back and teach African American history? Because really, I've been doing a lot of that in the United States history classroom. Yeah, so we do cover even more African topics in African American history in a certain way. The way it's broken out at Atlanta Metro is it covers the whole of African American history, like you were talking about with that one chapter from Kemet to I would like to say Barack Obama. From Kemet to Barack Obama in one course. So in a way, we can cover some different things than we covered in the U.S. history survey, but in a way, we can't go as in depth as we do in the U.S. history survey that's divided into two parts for a lot less time, coverage in a certain way. So I did want to say that. I also wanted to say that it takes more than individual professors and individual teachers, even though we're important in terms of developing and implementing culturally relevant studies. It has to be at the institutional level embraced. It has to be embraced at a policy level. So I don't know what the policy was at the time that you took world history, but I am in on some of these policy level discussions. And often there are people who run states like Georgia at the top, most of whom don't look like us, and some of whom who look like us in the best case scenario sometimes have to compromise with many, many people who don't have our interests at heart. Right? Who make policies that are like the ones coming from the top now. That's not very patriotic. If you teach about enslaved Africans, you're not focusing on the best parts of U.S. history, and you're making people hate their history. Or you're giving them the impression that, if you put more about Black power and civil rights movement in the curriculum, you're giving them the impression that rebellion is good. Or that this movement is more important than it really is. And so, look.
Are they taking the Boston Tea Party out?
No comment. Of course not. Of course not. No, of course not, right? So, or the American Revolution, right? You're just looking at the Boston.
Right, exactly.
But the American Revolution is not crafted, it's not framed in that way. No, it's not. And in my class, we talk about the Patriots, one of their tactics was to use plebeian crowd action, right? And hey, what is plebeian crowd action? When we talk about this particular, period in time, it's called rioting.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah. And we talk about all of that. I close the door. Now the door is open. I've been doing this for 13 years. Now the door is open on my classroom, but I'll tell the students in the class, let's close the door. Like real talk. Is this effectively different? Yeah. So, but at the policy level, sometimes we're told this is what you need to cover, particularly in the K-12 system. this is what you all need to
Mm,
cover in this AP World History class, because there are X number of questions and only 10% of them, 5% of them, 1% of them will be about African topics.
right.
And African
Yeah.
American topics. And so your coverage needs to, in the classroom, to help your students pass this exam and get this college credit, to get, more efficiently move toward their bachelor's degrees, then you need to not be in the classroom talking about Africa. So it's not enough to rely on classroom teachers, to just rely on professors to be the
Right.
spearheads of the cultural relevance movement, right? But that we need to make sure we influence policy, we sit on boards, we vote in local elections and things like that.
Yes, local. So I wanted to talk about, I was sitting in a pool of irony as an educator because I was in an AmeriCorps program and I was teaching at Carter G. Woodson Elementary School. And at Carter G. Woodson Elementary School, which was at the time on Donald Lee Hollowell, if you're from Atlanta, Bankhead Highway, and the kindergartners were still doing like coloring books and learning Christopher Columbus discovered America at Carter G. Woodson Elementary School. And I keep saying Carter G. Woodson for those of you guys in the know. Carter G. Woodson is the author of The Miseducation of the Negro.
And the founder
and
of the
Black history.
Association for the study of, at the time it was Negro Life and History, which originated Black
Right.
History Week, that then turned into Black History Month. Yeah.
So here we are at an institution with his name on it, and he spent a lot of his life dedicated to the re-education of Black people and trying to get us to unlearn a lot of what we, had been mistaught. And here we are and this was like 2011, still teaching kindergartners that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And it was like, and I had so much respect and love for the administration at this school, but it was clear that they couldn't do anything about it. And the crazy thing is, so my principal at that time was the late, great Dr. Susan Krim McClendon, who her father, Alfonso Krim, was the first, superintendent of Atlanta, of the Atlanta School Board. And so there's so much history, there's so much irony that we're sitting in, and so much of what you're talking about of the battle. So you can have the administrator, you can have the legacy, you can have the institution, you can have the city that understands the importance of even naming institutions in honor of our greats, and still have to fight with this curriculum issue because it's bigger than the city that you live in. It's bigger than the local school board, because a lot of these decisions have to go through the state level and a lot of these other things. And so it's a battle, right? And it's one that we have to be diligent in, and we have to be, fierce and make sure that we are aware of what's happening so that we don't, right, Alonzo A. Krim. And it's just important for us to stay in the mindset of there's always something to do. I believe that in the past we got to a point where we kind of fell back on our laurels. It's like, okay, we got these bills passed, we did these things, okay, civil rights, we won. Now it's over. Now it's going to be smooth sailing from here. But there's so much work to do on so many different levels. We also, I feel like in the past, focused a lot on how we did things. Like, okay, we need to focus on economics. No, we need to focus on culture. No, we need to focus on activism. It's not, no one thing is happening in a vacuum. We need everyone So if that's your focus, if you are strong in economics and you see that aspect of it, we need that. If you understand the curriculum and the education piece, we need that. If you understand the business models and you are more thinking like Booker T. Washington, and then the other person is thinking more like Du Bois, they're not mutually exclusive, right? They work
Right.
together. And I wish, and sometimes even in our education, a lot of our education, even when we're talking about Black history, our legends, our ancestors are pitted against one another, even in the context of us learning about them. Are you a Du Bois or a Booker T? Are you a Malcolm or a Martin? Do you side with the Black Panther Party for self-defense or us? And we're taught in the context of this or that when it comes to our history a lot. And I think I see a new wave of that changing, and I want to make sure that we keep pressing that. But even in the formal education years, the K through 12, the ones that we have a little less say in what we want to study as a student, we as the adults or the educators or the parents or the people in the know who have voting power have to make sure that we are aware of these things,
Mm-hmm.
are aware of, what we can do, though, to not be so beaten down that we feel like, oh, there's nothing that we can do,
Right.
that we do understand the actions that we can take.
Yep.
But I wanted to move on, unless you had a last thing you wanted to say on that.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, it matters who's on the school board, so pay attention to that. If you have something to add, run for school board. But if you're not running, and if you are, definitely vote in local elections for your local issues like school board, or local people like those who run for the school board. Yeah, so that's what I had to add.
All right.
Also,
I appreciate
we didn't talk about independent and supplementary educational programs. Those are also important. So I know that most of our folks are served in the public school system, but I must say, based on the work that I've done in terms of research, independent and supplementary schools or school programs are also quite important in terms of imparting culturally relevant education. So, shout out to those people who hold it down, like Quilombo in Decatur, but also, supplementary like Saturday schools and after school programs that get our us and our children educated in a culturally relevant way.
That's true. And that's important. I'm glad you brought that up and you brought that to my attention, because supplementary programming, I think that's a big thing in the Jewish community as well. Like, they don't just depend on public schools to teach their children everything that they as a community want them to know. And I think having that same mindset of, okay, everybody can't afford private school. Everybody can't afford to go to the entire school, but having supplementary programs, you can talk to different schools and, write a grant and get funding for an after school program that is tagged on to or attached to the public school, and, use their building and, create partnerships in that way. So there are opportunities to do this, in unconventional ways that don't create that many barriers. Not saying that it's going to be easy. Nothing worth doing is, but, it's not so lofty a task that is impossible. Right.
Yeah.
So again, this show is called Distant Relatives, and I wanted to talk to you about, so I know that you had the opportunity to do study abroad in Jamaica, right? And so when was this in your education? So you were already in Atlanta at this point, right?
Right. So that was my junior year at Spelman in undergrad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So going there, I want to know what your expectations were going into the program. And yeah, I'll start there. So what were your expectations going to Jamaica, and what did you think you would find?
Going to Jamaica, I thought I would find much more. I thought that people would be much more open to this idea of a transnational brotherhood and sisterhood of African descended peoples.
Mm-hmm.
What I found was that Jamaicans came in all different, not only shapes and sizes and colors, but came from all different kinds of cultural, social, and political, ideological backgrounds and orientations.
Mm-hmm.
And that the concept of one big happy diaspora was probably as much of a fringe concept as it was in the communities where I was coming from in Alabama,
Right.
and in the neighborhood surrounding the Atlanta University Center Schools, Spelman, Morehouse, Morris Brown, Clark Atlanta, ITC. So yeah, that's what I found. So I was shocked by that. There were people who were saying that they weren't Black, that they were brown, much like Creole folks in Louisiana often are saying that they're some other, something other than African American or Black. And I was surprised to find some people were saying that they were a different genotype than African Americans that was closer to West African genotype, so pure, read between the lines. And that, the African Americans they met not only were disciples of a very muscular United States dominance, chauvinism in the region, but, just kind of, mixed in terms of our gene pool. So not as authentically African as they were. So I found people who fell on all parts of the spectrum in terms of their perceptions, and I was really, really surprised.
Okay, so let me frame this. So you found people. So we're talking. So we know that Jamaica is multicultural. Most of the time we just see Black people, right? But you're talking about the Black people that you met, right? So she's not talking about the people who have descended from India who live in Jamaica, or the other
China,
Asian populations that live in Jamaica. She's talking about people of African descent, and these are the various people that she met. She met people who wanted to deny their Blackness, and then she met people who or coded in a different way, not Black or brown or this idea of other. And then these people who were so attached to their identity of being rooted in Africa that they wanted to dilute the experience or the rootedness of the African American experience. So it was almost like they were saying that we were less Black than they were in a way.
Yeah.
As to discredit certain things. So that's interesting. And so, okay. So you said that you were expecting a more like brother sister vibe, transnational, global African experience. And so when did you get that concept? Was it during your studies at Clark that you kind of developed that thought of the African diaspora? When were you introduced to the African diaspora as a concept?
At Spelman. The African diaspora as a concept was unfolded at Spelman to me. Yeah. So and eventually they get a curriculum that they call African Diaspora World, which explores the African diaspora's positionality in global history, global politics. So they were very, I think, pointed. They had a concerted effort to research and teach this concept of an African diaspora, an interconnected yet scattering of African peoples across the world.
Okay. Yeah. And so, like me, when I was reading these books, I started, to be introduced to the African diaspora as a concept around like the tail end of high school, based around my uncle and my older brother seeing my interests. And my brother and we read The Miseducation of the Negro. And then we were given Sabah, The Reawakening of the African Mind, Dr. Asa Hilliard's book. And so that book kind of opened my brain up to, okay, we need to kind of expand our look when we're talking about doing things for Black people, to look at Black people from all these other places as well.
Right.
And I remember thinking about traveling, and I wanted to make sure that, starting African Unity Initiative, and even the starting with you, the African Diaspora Dialogue, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but wanting to make sure that what I had been reading was something that was still relevant and, resonated with people in real life today. And so what you found on the surface was, you probably found some of that, elements of that, but not as much as you expected. Is that a good understanding of what you were saying?
Yeah,
like you found as much consciousness as you would probably find in the West End of Atlanta in your experience in Jamaica.
This is true. Yes, but the West End is a special place of Atlanta. Yeah, I think initially I did, but over time, once I made more friends and acquaintances, met more acquaintances, I began to understand more about what was going on. I joined a group. I made a friend named Brian, and I joined a group called African Caribbean Cultural Awareness Society. And he was he was a bold guy, great leader of that organization. And he introduced me to a lot more people who were invested in the importance of defining ourselves as part of an African diasporic family, and then working together on initiatives that would benefit us all. Then I understood Rastafarian communities better too. So Rastafarian communities often had a Pan-African, or individuals too, often had a Pan-Africanist outlook. So in meeting more Rastafarians, I found that although they were in general outcasts, or again, a fringe element in Jamaican society, they did have the sentiment, the Pan-African sentiment. So that was the more friends I made, the more comfortable I was in terms of this, and happy I was with learning what Jamaicans thought in that way, in that respect.
That's ironic. That's very interesting that you say about the fringeness and the outcast type of element that Rastafarians have in Jamaica. I say that because the irony is my introduction to Jamaica is Rastafarianism.
or the music, right? Bob Marley.
The music, Marley, my uncle, my aunt, my mother's older sister, she was a Rasta, and she was married to she married my uncle, who is from St. Thomas, I believe, or one of the Virgin Islands. It was one of those, St. Thomas, I believe. But they were like real Rasta. They were the first people I knew with locks, and they were bumping all the reggae whenever we spent the night over their house. and Bob Marley. That's how I know I was introduced to that music. And so everything I know about Jamaica and even the Caribbean as a collective was like first referenced in that. And to experience it for myself, and then through your experience, that they're like this fringe element of the society, and that's not like the totality of thought there. I can see how that expectation can come from here and then be brought down to reality, and it's like a hard pill to swallow. But it doesn't mean that that sentiment doesn't exist in the society. It's just, you know, not as prevalent as you would think, because even the advertisements of Jamaica, like the tourist ads, use reggae and use that element to get people to come because they know that's what people are familiar with. But to know that politically they're outcasts, and, you know, culturally they're kind of looked down upon by other Jamaicans who have kind of conformed or assimilated to that type of I guess European aesthetic of dressing up in a certain way, or, you know, being clean cut and clean shaven, and looking at that as a source of what is it, disgrace almost. So it's just interesting, and that's why we do this show also, to make sure that we are exposing people who haven't had an opportunity to travel just yet to know what to expect, but also to travel with the intention of looking at things from a global African perspective. So go in with realistic expectations, but also go in to find kinship, right? So there's a balance there, because what can happen is you can be overly looking for the kinship, and if you don't find it at the level that you expect, it can turn you away from it altogether. And I don't want that to happen to people. But when you go in with realistic expectations, you appreciate those that you do find. And so you don't look so much at I didn't see everybody, or it's almost like, you know, Twitter comments or YouTube comment sections. A lot of the times we focus on that one negative comment and forget all the people who were saying good job. And so being thrown off by the people who have these distinctions, these divisive ideas about Blackness or whatever, and not solely focusing on, okay, those people will come back for, but let me focus on the people who are ready to work with us right now, the people who do see the kinship, the people who do find it relevant to, you know, work together as an African diaspora. So I just wanted to, you know, say that after what you were saying, so that we can color it in a way of managing our expectations as to not be overly disappointed when we run into people. Because I run into African Americans all the time who don't understand half the stuff I'm talking about, or why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I can't let that color my view on my own people.
Or they don't agree. They might understand and they don't agree.
Completely
they don't
disagree.
think it's
Right.
the best way to
Right.
be in a world,
Mm-hmm.
a world in which, you know, Europeans dominate a lot of the commerce, or even people who aren't European, but who aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily subscribe to the perceptions of Blackness that we do. So, and then the other thing is, it may affect you if you go in and say, this is what I have a preconceived notion about what I'm going to discover about Jamaica, right? This other country. And then it may turn you away when you don't see that, but it may also, you know, turn the people that you're interacting with in the country away from you. Because I can imagine if I was like, yeah, I thought everybody was going to be like, you know, Rastafarian. People are like, so you exoticize us as this other, you didn't do your research to find out who we really are, and why do we have to be this way? Like, it got to be interesting, because people who got to know me enough to give me a critique in Jamaica would say, you acted like you were better than us. And I said, I didn't think that, and I'm sorry if I conveyed that message. Why do you think that? And some people would say, well, one thing that you did was that you called yourself, you kept saying you were African American and you only wanted to hang out with Jamaicans who identified as somehow African. And so to me, you were trying to say that you were not just Black like us, that you were something elevated over Black, right? And so I know you're familiar with conversations where, and perceptions where people are saying, well, this is Black and Black is akin to Negro or the other N word, and African is, king, queen, royalty, special, smarter than, right? Richer than. In terms, it just depends on the set of stereotypes. So I think if I understand you correctly, you're saying it's important to do your homework, right? And go with an open mind. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Because I saw this happen, right? I saw this very thing that I'm talking about. It happened in an African American studies class that I took at Georgia State. And we were learning about some of the elements some of the roles that some Africans played in the transatlantic experience. And just knowing that bit of history kind of threw one of my classmates all the way off. And they were like, then why are we even doing this? Why are we learning about this? Why are we even, trying to identify as, this, trying to build this Black community? They just wanted to tear everything down because there were a subset of people who had participated in the slave trade. And they took that as an assault of there's no reason to even try to fight against what we're facing because, they were saying there's no such thing as the Black community. There's no such thing as unity. There's no reason for it. Right. And when we manage our expectations, we understand that people are people. Doesn't matter where they come from. It's going to be people who do wrong. It's going to be people who do right. It's going to be people who fall in between and are gray. And so, looking at it and allowing that one element to kind of thwart you all the way off of your base is something that can happen, something that I've seen, happen to a lot of people. So we have to be very careful about how we, approach these things and manage our expectations. I remember having a conversation with you when I was going to the Philippines and I wanted to visit the Aita community, the Aboriginal community, because phenotypically they're Black, like they're our complexion. And you were saying, well, just make sure that that's how they identify. Like you got to go there and ask them how they identify and what their, context of that is and what it means to them. So that is always something I go into any community that I work with, even with African Unity Initiative. We go in asking questions. We go in introducing what it is that we want to do and how we, view African unity and what that means to us. But we also want to know what that means to them. And that for me personally as well, when I go into any community or when I travel. And so it brings people to the conversation like you value what they have to bring to the conversation. And that's always the way, I approach things. And that's the way that it gives people more comfort. One of the best things that ever happened to me in my travels, especially when I went to Africa, is that I didn't go to an Anglophone African country. So there was no way for them to feel like I came there looking down on them because I needed them to teach me how to speak. I was like a child. They had to teach me to talk. They had to teach me how to get around. They had to teach me the proper way to eat. So they look at me as a family member, even though they know I came in the context to aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was still tinged in a reciprocal respect of they respect the knowledge that I came to share, but I definitely had to respect everything that they poured into me to even be able to begin to give them the knowledge, because I had to learn how to talk.
Right.
And so there was a level of balance there that sometimes I think when we do travel, especially as African Americans, sometimes we travel with a colonial mindset because that's what we're familiar with, and we do it unintentionally because we don't even know that that's how we're seeing ourselves. When we are coming from the American context, you can go to Africa and you just, you're moving around like an American, and there's a certain way that throws people off, right? There's a the personal space element, because when you're doing the personal space, what that means is your space is more important than other people's, especially when it's out of the context of this place, which means that you are saying that you're more important than other people because everybody else is, squished up against each other, because there's no concept of that. So even just that, you're already separating yourself from everyone else. So having that in mind as we, travel, as we move about, and having that as an intentional forethought will help us create more, relationships. When we talk about this African diaspora and wanting to see kinship, we have to understand that everyone has a long experience since this whole transatlantic experience happened, since the Ma'afa took place. And so we've been in Jamaica, we've been in Martinique, we've been in Haiti, we've been in Peru, in Brazil, in the United States for hundreds of years now. So we have settled into different ways, different norms. And when we want to interact with one another, we have to respect those norms and adjust accordingly. And like we talked about in the multicultural thing, it's multicultural with Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
The African diaspora is a multicultural experience of a shared root, and that's something we can cling on to, right? And we can see similarities even in the various cultures, but it's also very important to just go in with the open mind of saying, I am willing to learn from you, and I'm willing to share with you whatever it is that you want from me, and I want the same from you.
Yeah, so I do agree that often we go into countries with a sense of superiority that is rooted in a colonial, or I would say even a neo-colonial, post-colonial kind of mindset. Right. And in ways that we don't always know, because I didn't think that consciously I believed I was better than Jamaicans, better, but there were ways that the country that I came from were exploiting, dominating and exploiting Jamaicans, right?
Right.
So I would do things like say, oh, we're out we're having a social event and people are making references to music. I'll give my input. I think this music will fit the scenario very well, right? Have you heard this song? And people are like, can you stop? Who's singing? I'm giving input. And they felt as if the American music industry even tried to dominate their own music. So they weren't interested in me constantly interjecting the American songs, which they were inundated with, and they were much more interested, and they were much more open to me when I made the effort to learn their songs, their music, their lyrics, and so, I did it, and I learned it was a definite experience in humbling myself in certain ways, learning to just don't be that dirty American who's always talking and, judging and interjecting and telling people how it's going to be and how it should be. So that was a large part of my experience. Honestly, it sometimes makes me impatient with people who might be from dominant cultural or social backgrounds in this context in the United States, because I know what it means to humble yourself. You can do it. Sometimes we're like, you know what? And I know what you're doing. If you didn't, I'm bringing it to your attention. And I know what it takes to humble yourself. Humble yourself, because coming in telling everybody how it's going to be and you don't know. Right. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's interesting that you were talking about dealing with an indigenous community, interacting with an indigenous community in the Philippines. Yes, I don't remember saying to you, well, you have to understand, think about whether they self-identify as Black, because a lot of times what we're doing is working with a social category that's been imposed upon us, our ancestors, right? And so it's not even anything that we created. A lot of theorists say this kind of Blackness that we know, the definition of Blackness that we're working from didn't really even manifest itself until the transatlantic slave trade, right?
Right.
So it's like many other categories, it's a social construct. And so and a lot of what we think about, how your color equates to Blackness or not comes from the dominant culture. So think about whether they self-identified in that way and ask them, which is all about, what you expressed, your Fundi effect in international organizing. So, and development. So it's interesting that you said, so when we're coming into these communities with African Unity Initiative and talking about that in relationship to Blackness, how you see other people, how they see themselves, because I have a colleague who's a psychologist, and she likes to travel like you, and she reports on her travels and, talks to other people about them and how what can be done with the information and the experiences that come out of our travels, and how we can make connections across national lines based on our shared heritage and experiences. And she said she went to a particular conference, and it was in the Pacific Islands. And while she tended not to define people as, okay, you're this color, so you must be Black. So she was shocked when Pacific Islanders were like, I'm Black like you. And she said at that moment, she realized that she thought of Blackness as African descended, bloodlines, right? But in actuality, these were people who did not claim African descent, or as she would say, ascent. They didn't claim genetic connections to Africa, but thought that Blackness, their skin tone and their common kind of experiences with marginalization and oppression made them Black. So it wouldn't be African unity, it would be Black unity, because they didn't claim any African heritage. So these all are very interesting ways of looking at the world. And what I think the great thing about what you're doing is you're looking at how this can unify us. Any of this can unify us, right? Yeah.
I wanted to take a comment from Facebook. So Charmaine says, even when I ask questions to foreigners because I'm genuinely trying to understand their lifestyle or culture, I feel that they are still uptight and condescending because they have the view of Americans as being know-it-alls or ignorant. It's frustrating. And I understand that it can be frustrating. But what we have to understand is that they have probably been inundated with so many Americans, and probably not even Black Americans, because sometimes they just see America as this thing, right? So a lot of the times when you go to foreign places or you interact with foreigners who are here as immigrants, they don't understand the context of, you know, the racial disparities in America just yet, especially if they're newer. So they just know what they know of America. And they've probably been, you know, impacted negatively by American society in their own country, or probably since they've been over here. So it's just a patience thing, and really building relationships with people. Like Dr. McCray said, when she started to build relationships with people in Jamaica, then they all started to understand one another. And then it didn't become a broad brush of you Americans. It was you, Kenja, right? And then if you, Kenja, can be this way, then maybe my broad stroke of all Americans is inaccurate and not, you know, you are the exception to the rule. Maybe I need to readjust my view of the rule. So I think it's just about building relationships. And that's something that I am very adamant about from the beginning, that you can't chastise anyone unless you have a relationship with them. Tough love doesn't exist outside of a relationship. You know, you have to understand that a person cares about me genuinely in order for me to take critique from them. In most cases, because people can be offended because they don't know where you're coming from. They don't know what the intention is behind this critique. Maybe you're trying to, you know, demean me. Maybe you're trying to, you know, say that you're better than me. But when you build a relationship with someone, you can speak real to them and say things, or, you know, ask questions, and they don't think that your question is to make fun of them. Because, you know, as being Americans, we have to be honest. We do make fun of a lot of people. We make fun of other. It's presented to us in our media as comedy, accents. You know, we can go down the list of things that are presented to us that way. Dr. McCray, do you have any response to Charmaine's comment?
I agree with what you're saying, that it takes patience. It takes the genuine effort to build relationships across cultures, cross-cultural relationships, to develop avenues for understanding, greater understanding. And understanding, like you're saying, Jamal, they may have been interacting with Americans who had negative viewpoints of them, right? But then they may also have learned a lot of what they know about Americans, and African Americans in particular, from the media. So it will take patience and an understanding that we're all actually sometimes learning about each other through somebody else's glasses, right?
Right.
And that, yeah, it's just going to take genuine interactions for us to break down those barriers.
Yeah. And I wanted to, so again, we have a long history with one another. And honestly, you are probably like a godmother to African Unity Initiative, because when I met you, I'd already had the experience of being at Howard. And one of the things that I noticed at Howard University is that the African students, they were together. The students from the Caribbean, they were together in like a cluster. The African American students were together in a cluster. And I was in all three clusters. Like I was intentionally in all of the three. And it was never a thing of I didn't fit in either one. Right. And so, but I didn't even realize the clusters at first, because I was just around the people that I gravitated toward and what I intentionally wanted to know. Because I went there with the intention of trying to figure out how to make a career out of the work that I wanted to do for Black people. And so I wanted to learn about all Black people. Right. And when I started to realize, I was like, okay, when I'm with these people, I'm only with them. I was like, okay. So, and my Nigerian, friends, they're not hanging out with my Jamaican friends, and my Jamaican friends aren't hanging out with, my African American friends. And so I start asking questions. And I was like, so what's going on? And I would hear all of these myths that I remember hearing growing up, like African Americans don't like Africans, back and forth. Caribbean people believing that African Americans are lazy and, waste opportunities of being here in America. And I was like, this all sounds familiar. But, I buried it because I don't just take things at face value or just believe things that people tell me. My mother will tell you. It got me in a lot of trouble as a child because I just don't take because I said so as an answer. But
I'm sure.
So
I apologize, Miss Lee, for your son.
So it was interesting. So I was like, okay. Initially, I was like, okay, I have to do something about it. And this is like toward the end of my semester. And so I was like, okay, next semester, I have to, get involved either in student government or something where I can do a program because we have to talk this out as the African diaspora. So didn't go back to Howard, ran out of money. So I pop up in your presence and like I say, serendipity, there's an open just organization that's just sitting there and you tell me, hey, I would recommend you to, take on this organization, Social Sciences Association, and then you can, make it into whatever you want. I already had like what I wanted to do. And so the first thing I was like, oh, we have to do an African diaspora dialogue or, conversations across the African diaspora. And because I had seen the same thing enough, I had been on the campus of Atlanta Metro long enough to see that the Senegalese students were together with the, Ghanaian students. It weren't a lot of Nigerians, surprisingly, but it was a lot of Senegalese, a lot of Ghanaians. And then there were some Caribbean people. And then, of course, African Americans. And they did not really socialize with one another, but I socialized with all of them. So it was like a mirror of my Howard experience. And I was like, okay, so that wasn't a fluke. This is a thing. And this is a thing that needs to be addressed like immediately. And so I immediately accepted your offer to take on that organization and was like, okay, African Diaspora Dialogue is something that we have to do because this is ridiculous. We are isolated. And the thing, what was happening was I noticed that a lot of the things we were saying about each other didn't sound like it was coming from us.
Right.
It sounded like something that we had been told.
Right.
And we were just unconsciously, passively accepting it. Did you have any experiences like that? And when I brought that to your attention, what were your initial thoughts?
Yeah, of course, those we're all experiencing similar things around what could be a chance for unity, this concept of Blackness, right? This concept of an Africa and its diaspora plays out on the ground often as divisions that are based on nationality, based on ethnicity, right? So yes, I experienced those things. And when you came with the idea, I thought it was a wonderful idea. And we were excited because the student was operationalizing something that we were all, like you're saying, theoretically studying, theoretically teaching, right? So add in conversations that I was having with other faculty at the time, like Professor Curtis Todd, Dr. Curtis Todd, Professor Bill Dorsey. Professor Bill Dorsey taught African American studies, and he's retired now, but he would always talk about how, these attitudes, these, anti-African attitudes or anti-African American attitudes that immigrants might have are toxic. and
Mm-hmm.
caucusing around our shared Blackness, our shared African descent is really something that is important for us in this context, right? So you wanting to put that into play on campus from a student's perspective, we were all really excited about that. And those African diaspora dialogues were some of the best, I think, forums that we ever had on campus. And I know some people may not agree and they think sometimes, so Atlanta Metropolitan State, one thing I say is that the student body's focus on workforce readiness type education makes it so I really had to think beyond the theoretical and think about the practical a lot. So I know that there's some people who think in the feedback that I would get or whatever, those forums that I participated in, that I helped put on, that were most practical, generally like, hello, this is how you get a job. People
Right. Yeah.
students tended to like. But I think it was, and I think it's important to talk about some certain theoretical issues and how we might operationalize these theoretical issues in ways that may translate beyond jobs, although job
Right.
creation is important. So I thought they were great. And so I remember the theme of one is, what do you call yourself? Right. And to me, one of the African diaspora dialogues that stood out the most, because you mentioned West Africans like Ghanaians and Senegalese people on campus, right? And they had a presence. And you mentioned Caribbean students, but the other population, I think it was Afro Latinx students on campus, right? And in this particular one, anthropology professor, Dr. Beatriz Morales, spoke. She's Cuban American, and that was awesome. The way she talked about, Afro Latinx identity and African connections, and how Afro Latinx communities might be excluded from general broader Latinx identities, but not necessarily seen or don't see themselves as part of the African diaspora, and why it's important, to be inclusive from all these different perspectives. So yes, those were wonderful, wonderful forums.
Yeah. And so, like, for those that don't know, like, African Unity Initiative, it grew out of the African Diaspora Dialogue because it continued to happen as I left Atlanta Metro. And then I continued to do it when I went on to Georgia State after I graduated. And then when I graduated from Georgia State, I was like, okay, I want to do this. I want to keep doing this. I don't have a campus to do it on. And so I started doing it at Auburn Research Library. And I was like, okay, I have to house this in something. And then I started African Unity Initiative because I felt like, okay, the diaspora dialogue is one element, but then I am from a housing project in Atlanta, and I saw my community slowly get gentrified, and I saw the city just say, you know what, we're tired of housing projects. We're going to tear them all down. And like the fact that we didn't have a say in that at all as the residents. And that sparked another thing in me. It was like, okay, we need some practical elements of not just talking about, why we need to overcome this divisiveness within the, African diaspora and just talking it out. Conversations are very necessary, but there are other elements that we need to be doing. And that's where the community development and the Bringing the Neighbor Back to the Hood campaign came in. Right. But like, I just wanted to let people know that while I have you here, you are like the Ella Baker to our SNP, where you gave me the space to do what it is that I wanted to do, and the encouragement and the backing to understand, okay, the things that are in your brain can work. You can do this. You can put on this program. It's a good idea. And like a Fundi, understanding what the next generation needed and understanding how to, cultivate that type of leadership. Right. And so I just wanted to give you that credit and let everyone that will watch this later and who is watching this now understand who you are and what you are to African Unity Initiative. So, godmother.
Wait, don't gloss over that. You called me, you compared me to Ella Baker. What? Like, that's a lot. Now, sister under pressure here, like Ella Baker, really? Okay, thank you. Now I got a lot of work to do to live up to that title, but thank you. Thank you.
You continue to do it, and you're doing it already. And that's the thing. That's like the quality of Fundi. You're doing it and you feel like, okay, now I have to do more, but you're in your actions. That is what you already naturally are doing. And it's not something that you have to overly think about. It's intentional, but it's not something that you have to like wake up in the morning and click a switch on. It is just you are. So just giving you those flowers. But yeah, and I wanted to just let everyone know that before I let you go. And I wanted to do one more question. So what are some ways, what are some tangible ways that people can get connected in what we're talking about? This global African perspective, this unity across the African diaspora. What organizations or groups or people that you are connected to or know of that you want to give the spotlight to, that people can actually do tangible African unity or get some information of how to put what we've talked about here today into action?
Yeah, so I know Malcolm X grassroots movement does good work in the community, and has more of a diasporic outlook. You mentioned that you asked about the sisterhood that I'm a part of, and then our connection with the brotherhood. So the sisterhood's name is AUSET, AUSET, abbreviated AST, and African Sisterhood. And we still have connections, but in terms of if someone's going to build something from the ground up, that was I wouldn't call us necessarily functioning at our prime at this time, but it was definitely an expression and a vehicle for my interest in the African diaspora and how I might learn more about being like my heritage, but also operationalize some of the things that you're talking about in terms of making community connections, pooling resources together. This is aspirational, right? Pooling resources together to go to the continent. Although some of the people in the organizations run tours to the continent on a regular basis, and almost model ways to make places in the diaspora and on the continent for us to go and to be more actualized in terms of the fullness of ourselves. So some have businesses that straddle the Atlantic Ocean, right? That give circulate commerce to African artisans, and then do things like sell goods like this to people here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean who want to express their African aesthetic or what have you. Some have school situations, supplementary and independent school situations, both in places like Ghana and in Atlanta, right? So first, making connections among people who are like-minded in your own community. And then I studied for my dissertation. I studied groups who were involved in this theory called kawaida. A lot of people have not heard of kawaida. It is the philosophy that produced Kwanzaa. So back in the day, Kwanzaa was one element of what people who followed kawaida doctrine did to what people might call re-Africanize or acquaint themselves more with elements of African culture. This was African culture in a large way, like when you think of the whole of the continent as part of our legacy and history. So there were different groups. One set of groups forms this umbrella organization called Congress of African People, and that had a lot of different organizations in it. Well, recently, a week ago, I watched a conference that was given through Auburn Avenue Research Library on CAPS, Congress of African People, CAPS 50th anniversary. And they had some instructives, right? Some of those groups still, even though they're not, like I said, functional, optimally functional. Some of the sisters and brothers still get together, still, like I said, pool resources, send folks to the continent, right, to have and into other parts of the diaspora to have those cross-cultural experiences. But they were saying in the forum, look, first of all, organize on your block. They said, we learned, from elders like Amiri Baraka, the poet, Amina Baraka, his wife, if you can't organize on your block, if you cannot do something on your block, going door to door, then it's not likely that you're going to be able to organize across national lines, across continents. So get your first start by making community connections and seeing what folks need and want to have done in your community and getting those things done. And community could be your physical community, or it could be, like I said, like-minded people. And so I know from organizing in, say, for instance, through ASET and African Sisterhood, one, to get to understand what everybody wants, that's its own feat. And two, if you or many people want, right? But two, if you find out, hey, this is what we want to do, we all want a chance to go to the continent. We all want a chance to go to other places in the diaspora. But not all of us, say, for instance, have the financial means. How can we make that happen? That in and of itself, that kind of work is important, and it's a step toward this larger idea of African unity, right? Yeah.
No, that's dope. And I love the point about start on your block, because one of the things about the way we do through African Unity Initiative development, even the way we look at African unity as a whole, we look at it as a micro macro perspective. So on the micro, it's the community. So if we're in Sierra Leone, like we have a community in Bo, we focus on the needs of Bo. We focus on the expectations and what projects those people need, and we fund those. When we're in Sigiri in Guinea, we focus on Sigiri. And then once they get rolling, and I feel like, okay, these communities are kind of self-sufficient, we have adequate funding, and now we start to introduce the communities to one another. So it starts off as just plain community development in a community. Then we start to slowly introduce that there are other communities, around the diaspora that are doing the same, projects, or doing the same types of meetings to get to projects that are relevant to them. Then we start to say, okay, Haiti is, Cap-Haïtien is in a position where they are functioning well enough to meet with the leadership in the Atlanta community. And now those people can touch base and get to know one another. And so is African unity practically. So you're doing something practical in your community. So it's benefiting you and your people, and you're saying what you guys need. So we're meeting your needs, and then we start the meeting. And once you start to meet one another, then you can start exchanging ideas. You get encouraged to know that there are other people doing things. Honestly, exposure to know that you're not the only one does so much for this type of work, or so much to encourage people, period. To know that you're not in the fight alone kind of drives people to continue on a lot of ways. And so I love that point of starting local, starting small, and celebrating those small successes. Celebrate what you can, getting a pothole filled. Celebrate that. Celebrate, getting a sidewalk built in your community where the children walking home from school have to walk on the street and it's dangerous. Celebrate all of those small elements. And it is very important for us to be encouraged in understanding that, wow, our collective action made this happen in our community. Oh, wow, we can actually do something. And then you start to elevate gradually to, if we did this, we can do this. If we build on this, we can do this. If we are collected with an agenda, that means our elected officials, they came to us. We didn't have to call them. They saw what we were doing in our community, and they wanted to be a part of what we did. So now we have leverage. Now we can ask them for specific resources to sustain what we're doing. So I'm all about tangible Pan-Africanism, because a lot of it is theoretical, and that's where we lose a lot of people who need practical action. Like, everybody doesn't have the time to sit around reading books all day, right? And writing research papers or even reading them. People have 2 jobs, they have children, they have things, and they don't feel like they have enough time to engage outside of their, personal family issues to otherwise engage in the greater community. But what we do is we show people that, it doesn't take all your time, because I believe in a beautiful burden that everybody carries. So if you're doing your part and I'm doing my part, then it's not heavy on anybody. So if you realistically, with your family obligations, only have 1 hour per week, we can use that 1 hour and make some, and productively utilize that. Even if it's just coming to the meeting and giving us your ideas. And then there are going to be people who do have the free time to take that idea and realize it. So there are things that we can do. And that's the thing that I just want to, get across to people, especially during this show, Distant Relatives. I want to not only talk about African Unity Initiative, right, but to show that there's no competition between these organizations. That idea is old. It's antiquated. It's not oh man, I'm with the Black Panther Party for self-defense, or I'm with us. No, I like the cultural aspect of us. I like the militant aspect of the Black Panthers. I want to be a part of both of them, and I will respect both of their places in history, right? And so that's where we have to go. And in this present time, we have to support each other. So if there's other organizations that are doing similar work, I want to broadcast them so that people know that, oh, wow, I resonate with that idea, or I resonate with that. My goal is for people to be a part of the solution and to be a part of it myself, and to engage people however they want to be engaged. So I really am very passionate about the idea of sharing resources and really getting all of our audiences familiar with every aspect of this ideal of African unity, and however and in whatever way it will be manifested through, whatever group or organization or individual that exists. So it's been my pleasure to speak with you. What I want to ask is there anything that you want to let the people watching, anything that you're working on that you want them to know about, and any ways that they can support you in the work that you're doing?
What am I working on? I have probably one too many projects going, one too many irons in the fire right now. And so most of it is, that stuff that you're talking about, the intellectual, writing things. So I'm working on the book chapter I told you for the book in Black Panther in Florida. I mean, sorry, Black Power in Florida. These were not Panthers. They were, like one of the things I wanted to do is look at other types of other organizations in the community.
Right.
So the other thing I'm working on is getting my book manuscript out. I wrote I'm calling it From Compliments to Service Leaders, and I'm looking at women who are affiliated with those, like I said, Kawaida influenced organizations and the leadership patterns that they exhibited, models and patterns for leadership. And then we have a project that was put on the back burner that's about Kwanzaa in Atlanta. So one way that people can support me is, like if they go and they comment on my webpage, kenjamccray.com, if they fill out, one of the forms and comment. If you know of anybody who has pictures and stories about celebrating Kwanzaa in its early days in Atlanta in the 1970s and maybe the early 80s, let me know. That project has been put kind of, on ice because of COVID, me needing to go into archives that aren't open to the public right now, to look and see what's there in terms of documenting Kwanzaa in Atlanta. I have questions about whether it had its own, flavor or whether it matched celebrations that were, nationwide eventually. So those are 3 projects that I'm working on right now. And I also wanted to be specific. You had asked me some specific questions. The person who you should kind of follow or get in contact with if you want to know more about teachers and how they what they African American teachers experienced in the aftermath of desegregation, integration. Contact G, the letter G, Fumilayo Devoe, Devoe. And she could be found at Urban Teachers Lounge. So Urban Teachers Lounge is a podcast that she does. And so she's at Urban Teachers Lounge, no punctuation, just Urban Teachers Lounge. Also,
and that's on social media?
On social media.
Okay.
And then the Sisterhood of Aset is what I said I belonged to. And then the Brotherhood, I don't think I mentioned that. They're Kemet. So, and then they're abbreviated KMT. And they call themselves Kemet Asen, KMT. And then another word, ASEN. And they are on Facebook as Kemet Asen.
I appreciate that.
My last words.
Yeah, and so I just want to flash your website and your social media up. Again, as she said, if you know or were one of those people in early Atlanta celebrating Kwanzaa, I know that, there are going to be some people watching this because I'm going to send them a link from the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And so I know they do Kwanzaa celebrations all the time. And so I'll send this link over there, and they may have some people who are still, in the membership who may have been celebrating Kwanzaa back then, or they may, still have some connections to some people. So I know that is at least one, resource. And but those of you who are watching live or on the replay, it's still relevant. So, you can contact her, like she said, in the contact us page of your website. And just leave one of those notes.
Or on Twitter. Yep, on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
Yep, I'm on LinkedIn at Kenja McCray, Ph.D. So leave me a note. I tend to check Twitter every day and LinkedIn.
Okay.
So, and shout out to the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Like when I talked about independent and supplementary school programs. They run one that was A1 for many years. That's where my children got a supplementary in independent education for a long while. And Gate City School was another one. Yep.
Okay. Well, as always, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I thank you so much for all that you do and for being our honored guest for this week's edition of Distant Relatives. Please, audience, please go out and support the work that she's doing. When her book is published, we'll have her back on to promote that. And, you know, as always, we love you guys. Please contact and support African Unity Initiative. We are found at africanunity.us. We are at African Unity on all social media. We are constantly doing work. We are pivoting during COVID, but we are still actively engaged in all the communities that we're working in. And so we appreciate all of the support that we get from you guys as viewers. We appreciate all of the financial assistance. We are launching a membership program. So there are going to be many things coming up. So just stay tuned. And again, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Thank you for having me.